Uh, when I came to this part of the world about 10 years ago, it was pointed out to me that if you want to manage for open pine lands, you have to pay as much attention to what's growing on the ground as you do to the trees. And, soon I realized that we have an absolutely spectacular remnants of this wiregrass longleaf ecosystem that are highly diverse and burn very well and are really a priceless treasure. And so I became intrigued by wiregrass, especially its burning properties, and I've set out to learn more about it. So today the talk will take the form of a few musings about managers and management. And then I'll talk about wiregrass and disturbance and a little veering into some community ecology. And then physical approaches using techniques of physics to measuring wiregrass and fire. And then I'll give you a few musings about restoration. I put up this slide here mainly because it's got some managers in it of quail hunting properties. That's Robbie Green there in the center with the red hat from the University of Mississippi, but that's his Tolokus and Osceola hat. And there's Jason, the dog handler, behind him, and another fellow who I don't remember, and then our research crew down there in front. And since I started working at Tall Timbers about 3 years ago, I've become more appreciative and aware of the role that these quail hunting properties have in preserving the very important remnants of wiregrass longleaf pine ecosystem. And I've become more attuned to kind of trying to steer my research into providing answers that are useful to them. And the one fella up there with the Tall Timbers hat, Jason there, I had an interesting conversation with him early on, or a few years ago. And he said to me, well, so if you plow up some wiregrass, how long does it take for it to grow back? And I said, well, it's not going to come back on any time that's going to be of interest to your grandchildren. And he said, well, y'all ought to do a better job about getting that information out there. So I have the sense that there's something that we're not, as scientists and native plant enthusiasts, there's some information that we're not getting out to some of those managers. And I really think it's our fault in many ways, we scientists and land managers, because I was looking, we literally wrote the book on quail management of quail lands. And I was paging through this book in preparation for this talk and seeing, well, what do we say about wiregrass and this kind of native grasslands in the quail management context? And the answer is really basically nothing. We just treat it as though it's kind of this old field. There's really no attention given to management of native grasslands in this book. So I think we need to do better. Now, as far as a theoretical framework for the talk today, I like the ball and cup diagram, where if we kind of think of an ecosystem state as being represented by this ball up there, if it's kind of in, let me see. All right. If it's in this little area here, this domain, this is what I think of as the wiregrass plant community domain. The ball can sit up there pretty comfortably, but it doesn't take all that much to push it out And then it rolls down into this steep hole down here, which is the old, I think of as the old field plant community. Now you can move the ball back up into the reference state, into the wiregrass state, but it's a pretty steep path that you have to follow it. So there you have the basic idea behind the ball and cup analogy. The first, as a kind of a preface to my first section, it's well known that wiregrass is a good indicator of past soil disturbance, precisely because it does recolonize so slowly. Once you've disked an area of wiregrass, it takes ages for wiregrass to move back in there. My colleague Kevin Robertson has done a wonderful job of documenting that. Now, management for bobwhite quail really being a kind of umbrella species whose management actually protects these open pinelands that we have here, because they're preserved in this open condition for the purpose of quail hunting. But this quail management is really pretty intensive, and it can involve soil disturbance, creation of food plots where you're growing grains to feed quail. There's feed trails that equipment moves along to spray out to drop feed to supplementary feed quail. And there are ring outs or ring arounds. Yes. A ring out is an area that is usually disked around a group of trees, and that prevents fire from getting in there. And it can help hardwood trees grow, and that can be a brood habitat for quail. So there's many possible small-scale disturbances of the wiregrass that can occur as a part of quail management. By comparing some of these disturbed areas to wiregrass areas, we can get insights into how these communities function. So I've been doing a study with a botanist at the Jones Center, Lisa Ginke, for some years now, although the data workup has taken some years. And this was a study that we started to look at the effects of trees on ground cover, but we developed a network of over 100 3-meter squared vegetation plots. And Lisa and her crew identified down to the last species, every single species in each one of those plots. And as part of our workup of this study, we started looking at the composition of the plots, and we decided to ordinate them or arrange them along an axis to look for the main patterns of which species kind of occurred together. And we also said, okay, which one of these, because wiregrass is an indicator of disturbance, we kind of divided the plots up into the ones that had wiregrass in it and the ones that lacked wiregrass. And we did an indicator species analysis to see what plant species were most characteristic of each one of those conditions, the wiregrass condition and the non-wiregrass, more disturbed condition. And we also, because we thought there might be a difference in the characteristics of the species that were in each one of these conditions, we did a literature review of the seed dispersal mode, see how those seeds were moving around. And so this is our ordination. And along the horizontal axis there, this is the the kind of the most powerful axis that separated out the species. And we found that the species separated really very cleanly. There was a different plant community in the wiregrass plots from the plots that didn't have wiregrass. And so these circles that you see up here, that's a kind of a statistical analysis. It's a centroid of that represents either the wiregrass absent disturbed plots here, or the wiregrass present plots. And in the plots that didn't have wiregrass in them, and examples of some of the species we saw were like Dicanthelium sphaerocarpum, that's round seed witchgrass, and Symphotrichum dumosum, blue curls there, Trichostema, and some blackberries and some blueberries, Vaccinium. And then as an example of some of the indicator species of the wiregrass present, we saw the grass, Anthodantia villosa, saw milk pea, Galactia, not sure what the common name of Ionactis is, skullcap we saw, Scutellaria, and Gay Lusatia, huckleberry. So two fairly different plant communities occurring very close to one another in this woodland that didn't seem to us to be particularly disturbed when we started out. It was part of the Jones Center. Many of you will be familiar with that beautiful property in Southwest Georgia. So naively, to me, it was quite a surprise to see how strongly these two different communities differed. Some of the fairly simple observations that we made were that the species richness, the number of species in these two communities, were not actually all that different. In the wiregrass community, diverse as it is, there were an average of 23 species per square meter, basically per square yard of ground. And in the disturbed areas, and I hesitate to call them old field just because they weren't like an agricultural field. It was just these very teeny, small disturbed areas within the wiregrass matrix. So, but those wiregrass absent areas had about 21 species per square meter. So really pretty similar. Again, I pointed out the large difference in the community type between them. And we also saw, as others have observed, that there was a big difference in the dispersal mechanisms between the two community types. The species that were characteristic of the wiregrass native ground cover were generally they had very short distance kind of dispersal mechanisms, either gravity, like they just kind of dropped right down like wiregrass does, seed does, or they were ant dispersed. Ants can only carry those seeds a short distance, whereas the species that were characteristic of the disturbed area tended to either, sorry. Sounds like thunder outside. Okay. So species of the more disturbed areas were wind dispersed, or they were consumed by animals and carried, or had some kind of other vector to move them farther away. And so implications of this study, it was just a surprising how stable actually these two systems were, in that there was so fairly little overlap in the species composition of them, which indicated to me, since these areas had been managed for quail for at least since the 1930s. It indicated that there's like slow recovery of these disturbed areas because they didn't have the wiregrass plants in them. But it also seemed like there's a certain resistance on the part of the wiregrass areas to seeds moving into them. Because otherwise these readily dispersed species of the more disturbed areas would colonize and increase the average species count of the wiregrass areas. So there seems like there's some stability. So why aren't these species of the wiregrass, of the disturbed areas, moving into the wiregrass areas? Well, perhaps there are some properties, ecosystem properties of wiregrass areas that make them somehow change their resistance to invasibility. And the obvious question to ask is could it be fire? Is there something about the way wiregrass burns compared to old field that is different, essentially? And the answer, of course, is that yes, there's a big difference in the way these communities burn. And we can look at the basic recommendations, prescriptions that burners use to burn in these two communities to get a hint about that. And these were laid out in a great publication by Robertson and Ostertag, 2007, in which they point out that when you're burning in wiregrass, you will generally not burn at really low, at relative humidities at 30% or lower. You're asking for a lot of scorch. It'll burn really hot at those if you burn lower than 35% relative humidity. Whereas with the old field, you need it to be, you can burn it at lower relative humidity, like down 20% relative humidity. That's great. That'll get it to burn well. Days since rain, wiregrass, you can burn it. Sometimes you can burn it, if it rains in the morning, you can burn in the afternoon, or you can burn the next day. It just dries. It's very coupled to the atmosphere. It dries off readily. And so you can burn it shortly after it rains. Whereas with old field, you have to wait for a few days for it to dry off. Yes, ma'am. Oh, that's relative humidity. Relative humidity. So with fine fuel, so moisture of fine fuels, longleaf pine, it'll dry down again very, very readily. And what Kevin and Tom Ostertag point out is that in longleaf pine, you can burn longleaf pine under a much wider range of conditions as a result of this kind of coupling to the atmosphere. Its ability to dry off readily means that you can burn in the summer, for example, whereas with old field, it gets pretty darn hard to burn in the summer. You get green up. There's so much humidity in the atmosphere, it's just really hard to burn that old field vegetation. So I've been, over the last couple of years, I have been kind of putting the ability of wiregrass to burn on a more, or trying to put some more measurements on that and get it, take a more measurement-oriented approach. And so I've been asking exactly, so if wiregrass burns hotter, exactly how much hotter does it burn? So one experiment that I did was to involve putting out thermocouples, and so temperature measurement devices just at about half a meter, 1.5 or 2 above the soil. Here we have there's a little thermocouple, little temperature measurement device that sticks out there, and then it runs down through this tube and goes into a logger, a data collector down underneath the soil. And so we burned, we studied the burns that managers were doing and measured the temperature of the fires at a ½ meter relative to the amount of just the percentage of wiregrass cover that was in the understory. And so we got a kind of a nice regression there, and we saw that went from 0 wiregrass, this is basically the old field condition here, up to 100% wiregrass, you got about an increase of 50 degrees Celsius in the burning temperature. So, and we published that and some other information in 2019. I should point out that Jen Phil, also a wonderful fire ecologist, has also done a study of flame lengths and other burning characteristics in wiregrass. And she showed that flame lengths of 3 meters from wiregrass. It was really surprising. It was far more kind of flashy and far longer flame lengths than longleaf pine needles, for example. I had an opportunity to work with some physicists from FSU, and one of them is Catherine Hancock here. She's actually a postdoctoral oceanographer, but she got involved in this study because there's some, she was looking at fire from the standpoint of the vortexes, the fire whirls that occur. And it turns out that there's some things in common with the way air moves in fire and with the way ocean currents move. And so she got recruited to work on this study, which by Kevin Spear and Brian Quaife in the Department of Physics at FSU. And here she is rigging up a pitot tube array. So that's an array for measuring wind speed, and it's an old method. In fact, when you get on an airplane, if you've ever looked down at this funny little pointy thing sticking out that you see between the crack between the ramp and the plane, that's a pitot tube. So pitot tubes can measure wind speeds under kind of extreme conditions. And Catherine had this rig that measured wind speeds. It was fire hardened, and it measured wind speeds in the horizontal and vertical direction as prescribed fire went by. And so she did a more thorough job of measuring temperatures at different heights as fires moved by, prescribed fires moved by in old fields compared to wiregrass. And you may be able to see there that in wiregrass, we just get this real big jump in temperature here up to 600 degrees Celsius. And then it drops down quite rapidly. And in the old field vegetation here, the increase was much slower, and the peak temperatures reached were not as high. So here we have a kind of a beautifully clean representation of these different temperature patterns that emerge in these two vegetation types. That is the air temperature, yes. And fire physicists get upset when you call it a fire or a flame temperature, because you can't really tell whether you're measuring flame or non-burning air. So air temperature is the best word for that, yes. So it's still, so temperature measurements are good, but energy temperature, energy measurements are better. That's a more stronger physical measurement of energy, of actual energy release, of course. So I am asking two questions about energy and Wiregrass and Oldfield. And one is whether the peak power, so when the power release in watts per meter squared that's coming out of that fire is at its absolute peak, is that peak higher in Wiregrass or in Oldfield vegetation? And the other question is the total energy, is it the total amount of energy released in fire, does that differ in the Oldfield and the Wiregrass vegetation? And I've been using this flux cube technique, which is kind of wonderfully low tech in some ways. You take a block of aluminum that's about 1.5 inches thick, and you drill holes into it. You measure the distance between the holes. Then you put thermocouples in the holes, and you insulate all around it and put it over a fire. And as the fire burns, it warms up the face of the aluminum block, and there's a very small difference in temperature between the outer surface of the block and the inner surface of the block. And from that difference and the heat capacity of the block, you can actually calculate what the heat flux is. So you get a much more rigorous measurement of the energy than you do simply from temperatures. Thank you. Yes, that is, I've got one of those little aluminum blocks, 1 inch by 1 inch, is sitting inside that little box there. And so it's there's a little hole in the box, and that block is facing down. And here with the fire, this is at Livingston Place. The fire in the background is bearing down right there. So it just burns right under there. And of course, we measure how much fuel is there so we can infer the role of fuel. And this study is ongoing, but so far I have found that in Wiregrass, we're getting that peak pulse of energy in watts per meter squared is higher in the Wiregrass. So here we're getting we're getting like up to 50 or more kilowatts per meter squared energy output as the Wiregrass fire goes by. And that so 50 kilowatts, if you think about a 100-watt bulb, that is the equivalent of, I did this math earlier today, and I'm bad at public math. So anyway, it's 50,000 divided by 100, that many light bulbs in a square meter. So it's a lot of energy release. And actually, so the total amount of energy given off, it didn't differ in Wiregrass and Oldfield. So it's really just the rate of energy release that seems to be the main difference in these two fire types. So the question arises again: what is it about Wiregrass that leads to this different kind of fire behavior? And here, actually, I don't think this is Wiregrass we're looking at, but it's a needle-leaved grass, and I think it's Muhlenbergia capillaris here. So we took a number of measurements of these grasses and other accompanying plants to try and get at what the physical structure, what it was about the physical structure about these plants that was different. And one of the things that was really striking was that the specific leaf area, or the amount of area that is amount of area that's covered by a leaf relative to how much it weighs is really teeny tiny for these needle-leaved grasses. Here, Arisida stricta, or excuse me, Bericiana, the wiregrass, and muley grass right next to it, these little blue things right there. So they don't have very much, the area that they make per gram of weight is very small compared to these other plants. They just concentrate that they concentrate that weight in a small area. However, that area is very tightly coupled to the air. And so I think of it as kind of like I think of a grain fire explosion. I'll get to that in a second. So this pitot tube array that Catherine and the physicists put out, I just started looking at these data recently, and I haven't quite figured out what the message is here yet, honestly. But we do see that here in where the wiregrass is burning. So this is vertical. This is the vertical movement of wind speed as the fire passes by. Got some birds in here somewhere. So as normally the winds moves over the vegetation, and most of the amount of vertical movement is pretty small. But then when a fire occurs, you get this rapid vertical movement of air. And so, how does that differ as you go by, as the fire goes by wiregrass versus old field? So down here in the wiregrass, we see that as when the fire passes by, we got this really rapid increase in vertical wind speeds, at least at the two upper levels. We measured these on 3 levels. So at the 60 centimeter level or so, we're getting that separation. It jumps up, whereas we don't get that same kind of air movement, vertical air movement in the old field. So the story is still being developed there. So finally, want to say just a few words about restoration. And because, so we know that wiregrass recovers slowly. We know that we have lots of areas that would benefit from having wiregrass restored to them. And I had some good conversations this evening already with folks who are deeply involved in that process. So I had a couple of sort of restoration assessments that I was involved in. And I also wanted to just talk about one approach, which is the Department of Defense approach, which I learned about on a field trip with the Longleaf Alliance about 8 years ago. It was great, up at Fort Stewart. And there in that Army base, they have tanks running around the landscape, and it tends to really tear things up quite a bit. And so they really take seriously, they have a wonderful wiregrass landscape there, and they really take seriously the duty of restoring these areas that the tanks have torn up. So they've got a big flail vac head mounted on the front of a tractor that they use to collect seed. And they have this, wiregrass really does better from if you start from bare ground. So they start from bare ground. They make sure that they have bare ground with this big V-blade mounted on the front of a caterpillar. They just plow the ground right out. You can see, big pardon? Yes. The item the tractor up in the upper left is the one that collects seed. So then use the V blade to kind of skim the vegetation off the surface. It creates these lanes. You can see a little bit of one right there. And then they blow seed right back onto the ground from the back of another tractor. And then come back a few years later, and you see something like this. You can see these vertical lines of wiregrass through the landscape. And there are places of bigger disturbance where they have actually done it wall to wall. And there's amazingly dense wiregrass with looks like a lot of forbs and so on growing in it too. So they have a method that works, but it's pretty expensive and beyond the reach of your typical backyard restorationists or even a place like Tall Timbers. However, what is more in reach for a place like Tall Timbers is to plant out with plugs and use herbicide to clear the ground. And I learned about not a study, but a wiregrass restoration attempt that was done by Tall Timbers manager Eric Stoller back in 2006. Had some areas that weren't burning well, he wanted to fix up. So here they are. There's these 3 fields up here, 2 fields down here. Site preparation, of course, is extremely important. And he did do site preparation on these areas. He applied Garlon and glyphosate in the 3 fields to the east. And then he mowed the areas that were less dense, these western areas. And then he planted out these plugs, spent tens of thousands of dollars on wiregrass plugs, planting them at 2 foot by 2 foot spacing throughout these entire areas. And then he burned them, took care of them, burned them twice a year. And so we came back 20 years later and learned about these and said, well, perhaps we could, it would be useful to see how successful this restoration was and to learn about try and find out where the wiregrass plugs really took. What were the site conditions of where they took? So we went all over the landscape, and you may be able to see some little yellow dots there. We took samples everywhere. There's a yellow dot on that picture, and we measured. We determined how much wiregrass there was, present or absent, how big it was, what the soil pH was. That's a key factor that can influence growth and survival in these soils. How much canopy cover there was. Was there a pine overhead? And also how dense, what the bulk density of the soil was. Basically, how was it really compacted or not? And we determined that it was about 2% survival of those many thousands of plugs out there. It's just a very tough, competitive environment up there in the Red Hills, especially in kind of a post-agricultural, Tall Timbers was a Civil War. It was a slave cotton plantation. And so it was heavily exploited and had much of the topsoil is gone. So it's kind of clay soils there. And so the old field vegetation is very competitive. It's just hard to get wiregrass established. We did find that having pines growing nearby was helpful. The wiregrass that was growing underneath, that was planted underneath pines was more likely to have survived. And also we found more acidic soils were correlated with a wiregrass plug survival. So I think it's potentially it's useful to know about that if you're going to be planting out plugs in this kind of environment, plant them near the trees. You're kind of wasting your time if you're planting them away from the trees, unless you know what the acidity of the soil is. That's kind of a challenging thing to get at, but if you're concerned enough, yeah, you could measure that. So one more restoration experiment that took place at the Jones Center, and that was initiated by Steve Jack and some other folks there in 2015. And the question was, can you take a planted pine stand? It was about maybe 10, 15-year-old planted pine stand, and can you underplant it? Can you successfully underplant it with wiregrass and other native warm-seeded grasses? Like, is that an effective way of restoring the wiregrass longleaf ecosystem? So, of course, it was a planted pine stand. It was kind of dense. It got thinned down to 50 square feet per acre basal area. So that lets in a fair amount of light at 50 square feet per acre. And they hired a professional restoration crew or organization to manage the restoration, and they used a herbicide mix, and they got rid of all the detritus, burned it off, carried it away, used a seed drill, did a wonderful job with these 5 native warm season C4 grasses and 1 forb. Planted them all out there, and then they were burned regularly after that. There was a little problem of Hurricane Michael coming through, and so there was some salvage and some damage to the ground cover after that, but it seemed to bounce back fairly well. And so we did an assessment 6 years later. A graduate student, University of Florida, Benzu Bania, did the study, and I was one of her advisors. And after 6 years, the vertical cover of these warm season grasses and this 1 forb Tephrosia was 15%. So the grasses took, but they really weren't the main driver of ecosystem dynamics in that ground cover system there. And Benzu measured a number of factors like some soil factors, like soil compaction, and actually she measured soil isotopes, delta C13. She did some fire measurements, and there was kind of a slight difference in residence time between the restored and the unrestored ecosystem, but there was just basically very little difference. So kind of the conclusion was that it's hard, as you know, restoration is hard. It's difficult to bring things back. It's kind of a steep hill that you have to climb. And with that, I do want to make a small advertisement for the field trip, which is on this coming Saturday, day after tomorrow, at Livingston Place, which is a Tall Timbers property. It's about 10,000 acres, and I guarantee you will see some incredible plants out there. It's a great spot. Richard Carter has Richard Carter and Wilson Baker have been surveying the plants out there for the past past few years. And I think what's the list? It must be up to 900 or something like that. 600. Well, in any event, so we'll be making an Oldfield stop along in accordance with the themes of this talk, and then we'll stop at this seepage slope, which is kind of an ecotone between longleaf pine, wiregrass upland, and a cypress gum swamp, and that is just loaded with interesting species. There's some yellow fringe orchids out there. There is some Ruelli, it's a melastome, whatever that's, Rexia. There's some Rexia out there. It's a really great spot. So I actually am I have 2 graduate degrees in botany, but I'm not that great a taxonomist, as you may have inferred. But I can wield my iNaturalist just about as good as anyone. And I'm sure there'll be some maybe there'll be some hotshot botanists along with us on that trip, but we will see plants. There's a really beautiful intact longleaf wiregrass fragment there that we'll stop at. And we'll also stop at this amazing historic home that was built back in the 1930s. I mean, it is spectacular. It's sort of along the lines of Pebble Hill, if you've been up there. And we'll be able to look at that. And if we have time at the end of the day, we'll go to a kind of a combination slope forest and floodplain forest where there's some real, more northern kinds of species. So in conclusion, disturbance to wiregrass ecosystems is profound and long lasting. And wiregrass influences fire behavior through its effect on peak energy. And that may behave as an ecological filter, which prevents some species from getting established there. Haven't demonstrated that, but that's kind of a working hypothesis. And clearly, wiregrass communities are very difficult to restore, and equally difficult is to restore the function of them with respect to fire. I would be remiss without acknowledging the many people who have helped me with these studies and helped educate me about wiregrass and longleaf. There's the group of FSU physicists, Quaife, Spear, Hancock. There's Richard Carter, who's helped me with putting together the field trip. My hunting property partners, Osceola, Tolokas, and the Watt family have been very generous in helping me do studies out there. Folks at Tall Timbers, Eric Stoller, the manager, and our field folks, Safira and Eli. Kevin Hires, I really owe a big debt of gratitude to him for getting me started at Tall Timbers. Georgia DNR, who manages the Silver, does such a fantastic job of managing the Silver Lake and other properties. That was the first picture I showed you. Jones Center in Itchway, I owe a lot to. Also Lisa Ginke, my partner, and various field folks, and especially the managers like Jimmy Atkinson, Scott Smith, Mark Melvin. They've really given me most of any wisdom that I have about fire in the South. I got from them, and of course my funders, the CERDIP, Department of Defense funding program, and Jones Center and Tall Timbers. That's it.
Thank you, Seth. Do we have any questions?
Yes, sir.
Sir.
Disturbance. and talking about what fuels were in these areas and how much you got out of them, you never mentioned pine needles. Is it just the same through all this area here, the old field and the undisturbed areas?
Well, the kinds of pine needles tend to be different. Of course, because you have the longleaf pine needles tend to have the longleaf pine needles in the wiregrass areas, and the loblolly pine and shortleaf pine in the old field areas. And so the energy content, as Kevin Robertson has shown, the energy contents of those needles tend to be the same, although the structure, they do tend to have a different structure because longleaf pine needles are longer, and they have, they're better aerated too. So, they may be contributing to this, that aeration could potentially be contributing to this high peak energy effect in wiregrass. Although generally, longleaf pine needles tend to prolong residence time, but not temperature. This is what we found in that early experiment that we did. There was no difference in the fire temperature according to how many longleaf pine needles you had, but it made a big difference in how long the fire burned. But your point is well taken, however, that you have different pine loadings. Andy? Did not measure soil temperature. Nope.
Temperature of fire has an effect on species composition.
That is, I assume that it has some influence on, or energy release or pattern of energy release has some effect on plant composition. I'm not there yet in my work. I'm aware of the Williamson and so on classic papers. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I've heard from Chuck Hess that in a pine plantation of slash pine, that's 40 square feet per acre, the needles will carry fire without any wiregrass. So this is related to this question over here. Do you have any idea what that number would be if it were longleaf needles?
So if there's no ground cover, what kind of density of?
You just planted longleaf pine and they're dropping needles every year. Then there's a point at which that stand will carry fire just from those needles. And it would be nice to know the answer to that. My question is, do you know what basal area of longleaf would do the same thing, would that the needles alone would carry fire?
Wherever you have a stand where the trees are formed a canopy, you would obviously have a complete cover of medium.
Yeah.
On the way track, the fires underneath the large trees on the way track fuel incredibly large movement.
Can you give him the mic? Give him the mic.
Very hot temperatures over 1,000 degrees. So it's quite, they're quite flammable, quite.
I don't know what basal area of trees make enough needles to carry fire without the worm.
Basal area. The needles, when they fall from trees, they fall underneath and out a certain distance. The taller the tree, the further the needles will go. So it depends on the size of the tree and the distribution more than the base area.
That's what I'm saying, 40 square feet, it's a area. Needles will carry fire. without the wire. Want to assume that that would be the same, or would it be less, but it only, it's the needles are longer and they dry out faster.
Seth, do you have an answer for that?
I don't have an answer. It does depend on what the ground, what other plants are growing on the ground, because it'll never be the case that there's just nothing else growing there.
Hi,
eh,
I have a question. Maybe you said this, but in those 128 plots where you looked at wiregrass and the co-occurring species, and then you consistently referred to the sites that lacked wiregrass as disturbed sites.
Right.
Was there any independent evidence that those were disturbed, or is that just a description? In other words, is that just your description and your assumption that it was disturbed?
There was no independent assessment of whether
Okay.
there was a disturbance there, and that has been a real bugaboo in getting our paper published, because
Kind of important, isn't it?
well, we didn't, the design of the study was really about the tree effects on the soil, and we were really unaware of the extent of the disturbed patches until we began looking at the data. Some reviewers say, okay, everybody knows. Some reviewers make the point that you're making, you don't have an independent measurement of disturbance, and others have made the point that well, everybody knows that no wiregrass means it's disturbed, and so why are you even making a big deal about that?
I think it's particularly dangerous to make an assumption that you have to have wiregrass to have an old growth community in the ground cover.
Could you say that again, please?
I said, I think it's really dangerous to make an assumption that you have to have wiregrass. In other words, wiregrass denotes old ground cover. And if you don't have wiregrass, it's not old growth. On the Wade tract, for example, there are huge numbers of patches that are dominated by big blue stem or by sorghastrum or other species. And Wilson and I went out and we've had long discussions dating back to the mid 1970s about whether or not some of these areas that people have assumed were old fields actually are old fields. And I think that the distribution of wiregrass has been strongly influenced by open range grazing. And I think there have been lots of studies done by range people showing that the cattle select the rhizomatous grasses, seaboard grasses, over wiregrass. And so they remove those from the community. And then you have perhaps wiregrass expanding as a result of that. And so there are lots of history going on here that's really important to dig more into. I think what you're doing is great, but I can go out on the Wade tract and find your old field communities in patches that I'm sure have never been disturbed. I'll stop.
Well, I appreciate that. It's an excellent point.
Thank you. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for staying, everyone.